Hello and welcome to episode 28 at the House of Dissent podcast. In previous episodes concerning Marx's theory of historical materialism, I included a discussion on how mass communication networks played a crucial role in the continuation of capitalism after the death of Marx, and that Marx could not have foresaw this huge and complex explosion of communication networks that would advantage the capitalist mode of production that emerged from feudalism. Whilst Marx understood how the press during his lifetime produced news narratives that sustained liberalism, he could not foresee the onslaught of mass communications that grew exponentially and at such a pace post-World War I, and certainly could not have foreseen the newly emerging public relations machine that would unfold in such strength beginning in the 1920s. Radio, television, cinema, advertising, magazines, and the expansion of the press via expanded railway networks earlier meant a new era in capitalist development had emerged in the 1920s. Writers associated with the Frankfurt School were correct to identify how mass communications solidified and expanded the character of capitalism in the 1920s. And this was despite the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which was seen as a threat to the very existence of capitalism in Western societies. And even though Central and Eastern Europe came under the Russian sphere of influence post-1945, it was only a matter of time, however, before they too would succumb to a capitalist mode of production. What seemed like an eternity of conflicting ideologies during the Cold War was in fact, in historical terms at least, a very short period for the entire Soviet system. Central and Eastern European countries that were controlled by Russia post-World War II exited by 1989, a mere 45 years or so in existence, which is a drop in the ocean when we consider the breadth of history. Interestingly, the subject of this episode, Edward Bernays, played a prominent part in helping to create an image of the Soviet bloc that was to be feared by citizens in the USA and elsewhere. As a public relations advisor, he sought to create anti-communist sentiment in the USA beginning in the 1950s and during the McCarthy era. What became known as McCarthyism was the product of Senator Joseph McCarthy during the 1950s, a fanatical extreme right-wing politician who sought to root out so-called communist sympathizers. This was part of the Second Red Scare, ranging from 1947 to 1957. The first Red Scare in the USA was immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution, from 1919 to 1920. Bernays' part during this period was to create a series of moral panics during the McCarthy era, to frighten the life out of Americans and ensure victory of capitalism over Stalinism, or as Bernays et al. Would put it, over communism. But this was in the context of a shift in power dynamics towards the USA due to the European Recovery Program, also known as the Marshall Plan, which President Truman signed off in 1948. 90% of the plan were grants and 10% loans which were paid back to the USA, because the USA knew a total loan would bankrupt major European countries such as Great Britain, France, West Germany and so on, and therefore would not create new markets for the exchange of goods. It was a masterclass in the continuation and expansion of capitalism. Consider this extract from the Hoover Institute concerning the plan and technology which would fast-track production. And I quote, "The Americans also delivered know-how, For example, at the Dobelman Soap Works in Holland, American experts showed the Dutch how to cut processing time from 5 days to 2 hours with new machinery. In Norway, fishermen used a new type of net made from yarn spun in Italy. In Offenbach in West Germany, Marshall Plan leather revived the handbag industry. In Lille, the Marshall Plan coal kept a steel factory in business. And in Roubaix, Marshall Plan wood maintained one of the world's largest textile mills. In 1945, only 25,000 tractors were in use on French farms. 4 years later, Marshall Plan aid had put another 200,000 tractors in the field. Overall, American investment in Western Europe grew apace, and more US patents found customers abroad. Americans had good reason for talking about the American century. Now, the term American century marked a move for the USA away from being an isolationist country towards gaining global control and hegemony in this new world order. The USSR was offered the plan, but they refused for obvious reasons, and so the sharp political, economic, and ideological divisions central to the Cold War began in earnest. The Cold War was always going to be a war of ideas via mass communications. Indeed, the BBC's World Service that was launched in 1932 and Voice of America launched 10 years later in 1942 were used as tools of soft power to counter Soviet ideology and promote the idea that the West was free, whilst the USSR was a dictatorial system that restricted human rights. But the starting period of this expansion was in the 1920s, the period that Adorno and Horkheimer identified as a major period in capitalist development. The mass communication networks had to varying degrees eradicated revolutionary ideas that would lead to the collapse of capitalism, and mass advertising of products kick-started consumer society, which in turn would solidify the production of commodities, which also promoted self-identity through fashion and other household products that gave the consumers a sense of difference, a sense of individualism. One, if not the most important characters of this time for promoting this ideal, was Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud. Bernays was born in 1891 in Vienna and died at the ripe old age of 103 in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1995. 3 books of importance by Bernays is Crystallizing Public Opinion, published in 1923, Propaganda, published in 1928, and The Engineering of Consent, which he edited much later in 1955. Place these 3 titles together, and we can see that Bernays' intention was to set out a program for manipulating the way citizens thought and acted, and he would attempt to achieve this through an array of communication networks. Bernays is often referred to as the founder of public relations, known simply today as PR, which heavily relies on a discourse favourable to the authors through persuasive tactics. In theory, public relations is or should be the opposite of journalism, one based on propaganda, and in Bernays' case outright lies, and the other supposedly based on truth, but it doesn't always work like that. There is no doubt in my mind that Bernays was one of the architects of the consumer society, where production and consumption of material goods would be the life force for the continuation of capitalism from the 1920s onwards. Here's a question to ask. How would Bernays use Marx's concept of commodity fetishism to his commercial advantage? Well, Marx saw commodity fetishism in negative terms, something that the workers would have to recognise as reason for their exploitation and suffering. But for Bernays, he saw it as an absolute positive and set out to crystallise public opinion by means of propaganda, so to elevate consumerism as natural, as something we innately desire, and that capitalism therefore was the only mode of production that would satisfy our needs. Chapter 1 of Propaganda is titled Organising Chaos, perhaps a term suitable to Donald Trump, and it begins thus, and I quote, "The conscious, intelligent manipulation of the organised habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country." Now, Bernays didn't just think manipulation was necessary to shape public thinking. He absolutely subscribed to the view that it was something relatively easy to achieve, because he believed that the mass of people is stupid or gullible enough to believe anything that is seen to have an authoritative and legitimate source, such as advertising and political and journalistic discourse. Bernays was influenced by the French social psychologist Gustave Le Bon, particularly Le Bon's book called The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind, which was published in 1895. For the record, Gustave Le Bon features in the second period of Radical Mass Media Criticism, a book I helped to edit, which is detailed in episode 1 of this podcast under the title In the Beginning. At the time of writing, Europe was experiencing a huge amount of social unrest through strikes and social conflict, and indeed in Russia they underwent a revolution in 1905. Le Bon feared that the masses were becoming a more unruly bunch, and more importantly, increasingly less rational, because they were organising as large groups, or mobs, as they were so often referred to. Mob mentality for both Le Bon and later Bernays was anti-thinking, and for them it was the greatest threat to cohesion and reason, the latter only being a product of the individual, the educated, and not the mob. Le Bon therefore announced that Europe had entered, and I quote, "the era of crowds," written in his book in capital letters to emphasize his point. And he says this, and I quote, "Crowds are only powerful for destruction. Their rule is always tantamount to a barbarian phase. A civilization involves fixed rules, discipline, passing from the instinctive to the rational state, forethought for the future, an elevated degree of culture, all of them conditions that crowds, left to themselves, have invariably shown themselves incapable of realizing. In consequence of the purely destructive nature of their power, crowds act like those microbes which hasten the dissolution of enfeebled or dead bodies. When the structure of a civilization is rotten, it is always the masses that bring about its downfall. It is at such a juncture that their chief mission is plainly visible, and that for a while the philosophy of number seems the only philosophy of history." Influenced by Le Bon, Bernays, writing soon after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, feared the crowd as a destructive force, particularly its threat to a capitalist market economy, hence his call to action to control the minds of the masses. Book 1 of Le Bon's book is titled The Mind of Crowds, and Chapter 1 is titled General Characteristics of Crowds, Psychological Law of Their Mental Unity. And it begins thus, and I quote, "What constitutes a crowd from the psychological point of view, a numerically strong agglomeration of individuals, does not suffice to form a crowd. Special characteristics of psychological crowds, the turning in a fixed direction of the ideas and sentiments of individuals composing such a crowd, and the disappearance of their personality. The crowd is always dominated by considerations of which it is unconscious. The disappearance of brain activity and the predominance of medulla activity, the lowering of intelligence and the complete transformation of sentiments. The transformed sentiments may be better or worse than those of the individuals of which the crowd is composed. A crowd is as easily heroic as criminal." Now, taking his lead from Le Bon, Bernays feared the irrational crowd mentality and therefore sought to control it to commercial and political advantages that would sustain and expand the status quo. So Bernays says this in his book, Propaganda, and I quote, "We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society." Bernays turned to the art of propaganda as the means to control the minds of the masses, and says, "Propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government." And then he goes on to say, and I quote, "The minority has discovered a powerful help in influencing majorities. It has been found possible so to mould the mind of the masses that they will throw their newly gained strength in the desired direction. In the present structure of society, this practice is inevitable." Of course, this raises all kinds of questions, including whether most people are easily persuaded by propaganda, public relations, news discourse, advertising, etc. And whilst I don't want to go down that road now in too much detail, what I will say is that thus far, time has proven they are. For why else would a system that creates inequalities in wealth, acts aggressively against nature, perpetuates poverty, etc., be sustained for such a period? Bernays is probably best known for his advertising campaigns for American tobacco in the 1920s, where he set out to persuade women to take up smoking cigarettes in public. The adverts claimed that cigarettes were torches of freedom, and that smoking in public places was an act of defiance and liberation. Profits soared for the brand called Lucky Strike. It was an exercise in propaganda through advertising and public relations, and was hugely successful. Bernays held a positive view of the word propaganda, arguing that in the right hands it promised a public good, although apparently he was distraught when he learned that Joseph Goebbels had read his book for inspiration before he took up the role of Minister of Propaganda in Nazi Germany, which is ironic given Bernays was Jewish, and Goebbels used propaganda via the radio to denounce Jews and create a Führer cult of personality. Goebbels was also inspired by Bernays' earlier book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, and was fascinated by Bernays' concept of engineering consent. The techniques Bernays had learned from Gustave Le Bon concerning mass psychology were also deeply admired by Goebbels, who on reading Bernays saw the potential of communications to manipulate the crowd towards Nazi ideology. This is one of the contributions Bernays has made to world culture, to provide the ideas for a Nazi regime to consolidate totalitarian rule. The other contribution he made was to provide material for political spin doctors that originated in 1980s America under Ronald Reagan's government. Spin equals propaganda, and Bernays was certainly the founding figure of spinning a story. Chapter 3 of Propaganda is titled The New Propagandists, and Bernays lists those who provide the ideas of which society is engineered. The usual suspects are there, and although he refers only to the USA, it is also applicable to other countries that have similar systems. It's the government and all its substructures. It's the Chamber of Commerce, boards of directors of leading companies, powerful financiers, the church, cinema producers, leaders of fashion, leading newspapers and magazine editors, and much more. And Bernays states, and I quote, "The invisible government tends to be concentrated in the hands of the few because of the expense of manipulating the social machinery which controls the opinions and habits of the masses. But there is a new kid on the block who interprets this web of ideas and spins it for public consumption, who Bernays calls the specialist propagandists. This new period of development in the 1920s, with its vast emergence of mass communication networks, creates what Bernays calls new activities, and therefore he argues there has become a need for a new nomenclature. Now, nomenclature is an interesting word to use, and it is linked to taxonomy, which today has more broader uses. However, both refer to naming or classifying objects and their uses, such as a washing machine, hairdryer, etc. All commodities in Bernays' world that require an artistry of words and images to persuade people to buy, despite the fact that we may not need them in the first place. Which reminds me of when Frank Zappa warned his audience not to buy things they don't need when advertisers in the US celebrated 200 years of independence. And you can find that on his album Bongo Fury, which he made with Captain Beefheart. Interestingly, taxonomic methods can be used in textual analysis to observe themes, categories, etc. as part of critical thinking and deconstructing text. Also, nomenclature was a term used to describe the Politburo or central committees in the old Soviet bloc, who also controlled the flow of ideas. I think we can also use the term cultural nomenclature, especially in relation to linguistics and the philosophy of language, whereby external forces, advertising, news and political discourse, for example, condition the way we view what we think may be reality. So, who were the new kids or propagandists on the block? Who could shape our consciousness? And this is what Bernays says, and I quote, "The propagandist who specializes in interpreting enterprises and ideas to the public and in interpreting the public to promulgators of new enterprises and ideas has come to be known by the name of Public Relations Council." And he goes on to say this. The Public Relations Council, then, is the agent who, working with modern media of communication and the group formations of society, brings an idea to the consciousness of the public. But he is a great deal more than that. He is concerned with courses of action, doctrines, systems and opinions, and the securing of public support for them. He is also concerned with tangible things, such as manufactured and raw products. That's right. Create the illusion, promise the world, make the public love the product, worship the commodity, expand consumer culture, and while you're at it, intensified commodity fetishism. Anyone who has watched the American television series Mad Men, Mad is short for Madison, as in Madison Avenue, may recognize the fingerprints of Edward Bernays all over it, and if you haven't watched it, you should. Because it is a superb exercise in advertising and public relations during 1960s America. And those new propagandists, in this sense the madmen, exported their skills worldwide, thus consolidating consumer society as a natural phenomenon. The main protagonist in Mad Men is Don Draper, the ultimate salesman using Bernays' techniques at his disposal. Pivotal to Bernays' thinking on commodities wasn't the product itself, but rather what it signified to the consumer. And in an episode of Mad Men, Don Draper said, and I quote, "Advertising is based on one thing, happiness. And you know what happiness is? Happiness is the smell of a new car. It's freedom from fear." Thus, what Draper was doing, he was selling the concept of happiness, perhaps satisfaction and even social status, the desire to have that best car, that biggest TV set, those expensive beauty products that hardly, or if ever, work. Bernays said this in Propaganda. If we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, is it not possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without their knowing it? Now, what Mad Men was doing was based on the assumption that the crowd, the mass, call it what you will, could easily be seduced by clever means of persuasion and advertising techniques straight out of the Bernays approach to solidifying and expanding consumer society. And when Bernays, with reference to the new Public Relations Council, said, and I quote, "He functions primarily as an advisor to his client, very much as a lawyer does." And this was exactly what Don Draper and his colleagues were doing in Mad Men, which is what salespeople routinely do. Another term that Bernays used to describe the masses was herd, who had a mentality akin to cattle, unable to think for themselves. So the new propagandists, or in this sense, in this instance, advertising companies, would do the thinking for them. And Bernays confirms this thus, and I quote, "Le Bon concluded that the group mind does not think in the strict sense of the word. In place of thoughts, it has impulses, habits and emotions. In making up its mind, its first impulse is usually to follow the example of a trusted leader. This is one of the most firmly established principles of mass psychology." Now, that said, he knew that in terms of lifestyle products, the mass would have to be dissected into various social and cultural groups, and insisted that the new propagandists would need to understand their audience's needs to be able to persuade them to purchase a product. In Bernays' first book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, published in 1923, it's clear that for him public opinion is groupthink, and uses Wilfred Trotter as his main source, whose book, called Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War, published in 1916, was of great influence on Bernays' thinking. Bernays extrapolates from Trotter that public opinion is a product of the herd. And what interested Bernays was whether public opinion was stubborn or malleable, as detailed in Chapter 2. By the way, for the record, Trotter studied the activities of sheep. In relation to public opinion, Bernays' concerns here are not advertising, but rather the press, who through news frames create a reality, or as Gay Tuckman later said, news frames are the windows on the world, or something like that. There's no doubt that Bernays, Le Bon, Trotter, and even writers not mentioned here, such as Ortega y Gasset, Matthew Arnold, etc., had nothing but contempt for the people, which drove their ideology and cultural views of society. But that does not diminish the power of advertising products, whose objectives are to create lifestyle and lifestyle is a relatively new concept, beginning around 1916, when the Austrian psychologist Alfred Adler introduced the term, in German, which is Lebensstil, although lifestyle wasn't fully associated with consumerism until the 1960s. It's worth mentioning that it was Roland Barthes who undertook a study of how consumption of commodities was central to sustaining the capitalist mode of production. In Barthes' book Mythologies, published in 1957, he analysed everyday products and cultural norms, which embedded capitalist ideology into the conscience of people. Barthes was abundantly clear what underscored myth in the modern sense, saying, and I quote, "What is myth today? I shall give at the outset a first very simple answer, which is perfectly consistent with etymology. Myth is a type of speech." And Barthes goes on to say this, I quote, "Of course it is not any type. Language needs special conditions in order to become myth. We shall see them in a minute. But what must be firmly established at the start is that myth is a system of communication, that it is a message." Now, myth for Barthes is a mode of signification, but not any old mode. For this mode of signification, persuasion, propaganda, to use Bernays' language, is constructed and perfected under the mode of production that is capitalism, which promotes commercial interests. In sum, what we have here, according to this logic, is that myth is ideology, the transmission of ideas from powerful interests. For the record, Michel Foucault's emphasis on the term discourse is also ideology, and myth and discourse are therefore closely related as a mode of signification and a mode of transferring language into meaning. One classic example that Barthes used of how signification works is a universal, timeless sense is of the male offering his lover a rose. The rose is, in its organic state, the signifier. It's a flower. But when it's given to the lover, the rose signifies love. Signifier and signified are therefore united in cultural meaning. Examples of how signification works in an advanced commercial environment under capitalist relations are many. Branding requires different logos to compete and separate one from another. Take a look at a logo of a popular brand and ask yourself, what is the myth? What is it conveying? What is it signifying? As Barthes said, and I quote, "We know that myth is a type of speech defined by its intention, and the motivation is necessary to the very duplicity of myth." Now, we don't have to engage in a discourse analysis of Bernays' work to understand its meaning, because it's abundantly clear that, and I'm referring to Barthes here, that the intention of the message was to dupe people, or to use Bernays' language, the herd, into believing what was being signified to them. And to use Barthes again, the motivation for Bernays is also abundantly clear: to sell a product or idea for commercial and political reasons. 32 years after Bernays published Crystallizing Public Opinion, he edited The Engineering of Consent in 1955, a year after the coup in Guatemala in 1954, in which Bernays was the central character to the demise of the democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And in the opening chapter, Bernays reaffirms his theory thus, and I quote, "Public relations is the attempt by information, persuasion, and adjustment to engineer public support for an activity, cause, movement, or institution." Bernays orchestrated the coup through a public relations campaign of lies. Lies that Bernays approved of, as long as they served commercial and American foreign policy interests in what would become seen by the USA as their backyard in Latin America. From 1931 to 1944, Guatemala was ruled by Jorge Ubico, a vicious dictator who was a good friend of the USA, and that good friend established Decree 1816 in Guatemala, which made it a legal requirement to murder an indigenous farmer who refused to comply with the new law. Nice. Ubico destroyed all political parties and suppressed freedom of speech and the press that apparently are, bastions. Arbenz Guzman was democratically elected in 1951 and deposed by a CIA-led coup. Bernays at the time was the public relations officer and advisor to the United Fruit Company, who orchestrated the propaganda machine which led to deposing Arbenz Guzman in 1954. Now here's the thing. Why depose a democratically elected president whose goal was to bring Guatemala away from feudalism and move it towards a capitalist society? Well, because Arbenz Guzman wanted to embark on a land reform that gave land to poor peasants to harvest, and that was not in the interests of the USA and the United Fruit Company. So Bernays set out to discredit Arbenz Guzman by producing a lie that accused him of being a communist sympathizer, which he was not. In memory of these events, the Mexican artist Diego Rivera produced his Glorioso Victoria, which depicts the illegal CIA-led coup in 1954. In the painting we can see Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, who had the support of the Americans, greeting the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, who is seen holding a bomb with the face of Eisenhower on it. It's a powerful image that also shows the people who were murdered during the coup. The U.S. Ambassador, John Purifoy, stands amongst military officers, with the then CIA Director, Alan W. Dulles, whispering into his brother's ear. Alan Dulles has a bag of money upon him, and their chosen coup, Colonel Armas, has a wad of dollars stuffed into his coat pocket. The Archbishop of Guatemala, Mariano Rosel Arellano, stands as he blesses the scene that includes Guatemalan protesters. If you have enjoyed this podcast and others, please leave a comment, click like, or even follow me. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.